In the winter of 1944, some of the most battle-hardened officers in the entire German military sat down and wrote about the men they were fighting at Monte Cassino. These were SS Panzer commanders, men who had fought on the Eastern Front, men who had pushed through France and North Africa, men who had seen everything war had to offer. And in their private diaries, in letters they wrote to their families, in after-action reports that were never meant to be read by the enemy, they described the soldiers facing them across the rubble of Cassino with words that nobody expected. Words like extraordinary, relentless, impossible to stop. They were writing about New Zealanders, farmers and tradesmen from a country most of them had never heard of. And what those diary entries reveal about what really happened at Monte Cassino is a story that history somehow forgot to tell properly. This is that story. To understand why those diary entries matter, you first have to understand what Monte Cassino actually was, because calling it a battle undersells it. Monte Cassino was a 4-month-long nightmare, a grinding, brutal, exhausting fight over a single piece of ground that neither side could afford to lose. Picture this: a mountain in central Italy. On top of that mountain, a monastery that had stood for 1,400 years. Below it, a small town called Cassino, reduced to rubble by months of air raids and artillery. Running through the valley at the base of the mountain, the Gustav Line. This was the main German defensive position in Italy, and it was one of the most carefully constructed defensive lines of the entire war. The Germans had spent months turning every building, every hillside, every river crossing into a fortress. They had dug tunnels through the rock. They had positioned artillery where it could cover every approach. They had fields of fire so perfectly arranged that any army trying to advance through the valley would be cut to pieces before it got halfway across. And the Allies had to break through it, because behind the Gustav Line lay Rome, and behind Rome lay the rest of Italy. And the Allies needed Italy because they needed a second front to take pressure off the massive Soviet push in the east and to force Germany to split its forces. Monte Cassino was not just one battle in one war. It was the pivot point of the entire Italian campaign. Whoever held that mountain controlled the road north, and the Germans knew it. The man commanding the German forces at Cassino was General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin, a Rhodes Scholar, a man who had studied at Oxford, cultured, intelligent, deeply religious. He was also one of the finest defensive tacticians the Wehrmacht ever produced. He took the natural terrain of the Cassino Valley, already nearly impossible to cross, and turned it into something that would stop 4 separate Allied offensives. The first attack in January 1944 failed. The second attack in February failed. By the time the third major Allied assault was being planned, the commanders on both sides understood that whatever happened next at Cassino was going to define the entire Italian campaign. That was the moment the New Zealanders stepped forward. The 2nd New Zealand Division had already built a reputation in North Africa that made other Allied commanders stop and pay attention. These were not new soldiers. They had fought Rommel across the desert. They had been at Sidi Rezegh, at Minkarkaim, at the breakout from El Alamein. They had taken on German armor in open desert with anti-tank guns and bayonets when they had nothing better. They had been encircled, they had broken out, and they had kept fighting. By the time they arrived in Italy, the 2nd New Zealand Division was considered by many Allied commanders to be the single best division in the entire theater. Not just good, the best. Their commander was Lieutenant General Bernhard Freyberg, a man who had won the Victoria Cross in the First World War, a man who had been wounded so many times that his body carried more than 24 scars from bullet and shrapnel wounds, a man Churchill once described as having a hide like a rhino. Freyberg was not subtle. He was not elegant. He believed in hitting the enemy hard and not stopping until something gave. And at Cassino, that instinct would be tested against defenses that were almost physically impossible to break. The men under Freyberg were a mix that reflected New Zealand itself. Farmers who had never left their home province before the war, tradesmen who had signed up on the first day conscription opened, teachers, mechanics, shepherds, men who had grown up in a country where hard physical work was just a normal part of life. They were fit, they were tough, and they had a particular quality that military historians have noted again and again when studying the 2nd New Zealand Division. They did not panic. Under artillery bombardment that would scatter other units, the New Zealanders tended to get quiet and focused rather than frightened and disorganized. German commanders who faced them in North Africa had already made note of this. At Cassino, the SS officers on the other side of the wire were about to discover it for themselves. The Third Battle of Cassino began on the 15th of March, 1944. It was preceded by one of the largest air bombardments of the Italian campaign. Hundreds of Allied aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Cassino town and the surrounding area. The bombardment was so massive, so total, that Allied commanders watching it assumed nothing could survive underneath it. When it was over, they fully expected to walk through what remained of the town. What they did not expect was what they found. German soldiers emerging from tunnels and basements and reinforced positions, shaken but alive, picking up their weapons and preparing to fight. The bombing had not destroyed the Gustav Line. It had, in many places, made it worse. The rubble of destroyed buildings created natural defensive positions that were actually harder to assault than the original structures had been. And into that rubble walked the New Zealanders. The fighting in Cassino town that followed the bombardment was not the kind of war most people imagine when they think of the Second World War. There were no open fields, no clear lines of advance. It was room to room, building to building, sometimes floor to floor inside the same structure. A distance of 50 meters could take an entire day to cover. A single machine gun position in a collapsed building could hold up a company of men for hours. Every corner was potentially the last corner a man would turn. Every doorway was a potential ambush. Every pile of rubble could be hiding a German soldier with a submachine gun waiting for someone to come close enough. The German units holding Cassino during this phase included elements of the 1st Parachute Division and units from the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division. These were elite troops. The parachutists in particular were considered among the best soldiers in the entire German military. They were not conscripts. They were volunteers who had been through some of the hardest training the Wehrmacht offered, and they had chosen their defensive positions in Cassino with expert care. Every alley, every rubble pile, every flooded shell crater had been thought through. They knew exactly where the New Zealanders would have to come from, and they had arranged to make every step of that approach as costly as possible. And then the diary entries started. Not all of the diary entries and letters that came out of Monte Cassino have been published in English. Many sat in German military archives for decades before researchers started going through them properly. Some were published in German regimental histories that were never translated. But enough of them exist. Enough have been studied and translated and quoted by historians like John Ellis and Matthew Parker and Carlo D'Este to give a very clear picture of what the men on the other side of the wire thought about the 2nd New Zealand Division. One German parachute officer, writing to his wife in mid-March 1944, described the New Zealanders advancing through the rubble of Cassino town as men who seemed to have no understanding of the word impossible. He wrote that his men had held a position all morning against repeated attacks, and that every time they pushed the New Zealanders back, the New Zealanders simply paused, reorganized, and came again. Not in a rush, not in a panic. They came again in the same careful, methodical way. As if they had all the time in the world. As if the defensive fire was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Another officer, a company commander from the 1st Parachute Division, recorded in his diary that the most unsettling thing about fighting the New Zealanders was their silence. Most troops, when advancing under fire, shouted. It was a way of managing fear, of communicating, of pushing through the instinct to stop and find cover. The New Zealanders advanced in near silence. He wrote that hearing nothing from an attacking force was more frightening than hearing noise, because silence meant the men coming toward you were in control of themselves. They were not being driven by adrenaline. They were thinking. A senior officer in the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division noted in his war diary that after 2 days of fighting in Cassino town, his men had begun to develop a specific anxiety about the New Zealanders that he had not seen his soldiers show toward other opponents. He wrote that the New Zealand soldiers had a quality that was difficult to describe. They were not reckless, they did not take unnecessary risks, but once they committed to an objective, they did not leave it. He had watched units break off attacks and withdraw when the cost became too high. That was normal. That was rational. The New Zealanders did not seem to calculate cost in the same way. They simply kept coming. This observation appears in multiple independent accounts from the German side. It was not a compliment from a single generous officer. It was a consistent pattern that commanders in different units, in different parts of the Cassino front, all noticed and all recorded. The 2nd New Zealand Division under fire moved differently from other armies, and the Germans could not figure out why. Part of the answer was Freyberg's approach to leadership. He was at the front constantly. His divisional commanders were at the front constantly. The New Zealand Army had a tradition stretching back to the First World War and reinforced by the culture of the country itself, that officers were not separate from their men. They ate what their men ate. They slept where their men slept. They led from the front, not from the rear. When the men of the 2nd New Zealand Division advanced into the rubble of Cassino, they were advancing alongside officers who would take the same risks they were being asked to take. That creates a different kind of unit. A unit where the men feel that the decision to advance has been made by someone who understands the cost because they are paying it alongside you. But the fighting at Cassino went far beyond the town itself. The monastery on the ridge above was the key to the entire position, and both sides knew it. The Allies had already controversially bombed the monastery in February, wrongly believing it was being used as a German observation post. The bombing had not destroyed the German position. If anything, the rubble of the monastery walls had given the German defenders even better cover than the original structure. And the ridge below the monastery, known as Castle Hill, and the rocky outcrops around Point 593, had become the most bitterly contested ground in the entire campaign. It was here, on the ridges and rocks and steep hillsides below the monastery, that the fighting took on a quality that participants on both sides would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. There were no roads on those rocks. There were no trenches in the traditional sense. Men clung to ledges. They fought over individual boulders. A German machine gun 30 meters above you on a rock face might as well have been on the moon for how difficult it was to reach. A New Zealand soldier climbing that face in the dark, with only a rifle and a grenade, was doing something that defied rational military calculation. A German officer from the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Parachute Regiment wrote in his diary on the 19th of March that he had watched a small group of New Zealand soldiers climb the southern face of Castle Hill under direct fire from 2 machine gun positions. He watched them take casualties. He watched them stop and reorganize on a narrow ledge with nowhere to shelter. And then he watched them keep climbing. He wrote that he had been at Stalingrad. He had been in Crete. He had seen Red Army soldiers do things under fire that seemed physically impossible, but he had never watched men climb toward machine guns with the calm deliberateness that these New Zealanders showed. He used a word that translated roughly as unhurried. They were unhurried. Another diary, this one from a signals officer who was not even directly involved in the fighting but was close enough to observe, described the New Zealanders at night. The fighting at Cassino was not limited to daylight. Both sides sent patrols out after dark, probing for weakness, trying to take prisoners, trying to seize positions that could not be taken by direct assault in daylight. The German signals officer wrote that the New Zealand night patrols were unlike anything he had experienced on other fronts. He could hear German patrols. He could hear other Allied patrols. The New Zealanders made almost no sound. He wrote in his diary that twice in 1 week, New Zealand soldiers had appeared inside positions that he had believed were secure, had done what they came to do, and had disappeared again before anyone fully understood what had happened. The supply situation for both sides at Cassino was genuinely terrible. The ground was so broken, so completely covered by enemy observation and fire, that supplying the forward positions was an enormous undertaking. For the German defenders, supply lines ran through tunnels and along paths that could only be used at night. For the New Zealanders attacking across open ground, every man and every piece of ammunition had to be carried forward under fire. Rations were often cold or non-existent. Water was difficult to get forward. Medical evacuation of the wounded was a nightmare. Men fought for days in conditions that would have stopped many other armies simply due to physical exhaustion, without reference to enemy action at all. A German medical officer attached to the 1st Parachute Division kept a detailed diary of the Cassino period, and his observations about the enemy are particularly striking because he was watching from a different angle. He treated wounded prisoners. He talked to captured New Zealand soldiers while they waited for evacuation. He wrote that the men he saw were lean and quiet and gave very little away. He noted that several of the wounded men he observed insisted on making their own way to the rear rather than being carried, not out of bravado, but because they seemed uncomfortable with the idea of being a burden. He found this unusual enough to write down. He concluded his observations on the New Zealanders with a line that has been quoted by several historians since. He wrote that fighting men were common. Men who genuinely did not seem afraid were rarer. And men who were not afraid and also did not want to show off about it were the rarest of all. He wrote that the New Zealanders seemed to belong to that last group. By late March of 1944, the Third Battle of Cassino had stalled. The New Zealanders and the Indian troops fighting alongside them had made significant gains. They held Castle Hill. They held parts of Cassino town, but the monastery itself, sitting on the summit of Monte Cassino, was still in German hands, and the approaches to it were still defended by the 1st Parachute Division with a ferocity that defied the scale of the losses they were taking. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides had suffered enormously. The third battle was called off. But the diary entries did not stop. German officers who had fought through all 3 major phases of the Cassino battle, by the time the 4th and final assault came in May 1944, part of Operation Diadem, and a massive coordinated Allied offensive along the entire Gustav Line, were writing with a very clear-eyed understanding of what they were dealing with. One regimental commander in the 1st Parachute Division wrote a long assessment in his personal diary in early May, just before the final offensive opened, in which he reviewed what he had learned about the different Allied units he had faced. His assessments of American, British, French, Polish, and Indian units were measured and professional. His assessment of the New Zealanders was different. He wrote that of all the forces he had faced at Cassino, the 2nd New Zealand Division was the one he found most difficult to reduce to a tactical formula. Most armies, he wrote, followed patterns that a professional officer could learn to anticipate. The New Zealanders did not follow patterns in the same way. They adapted. Each attack was shaped by the specific conditions rather than by a pre-existing playbook. He found this deeply inconvenient. He also found it, as he admitted in the same entry, frankly impressive. That final German observation gets at something important about the 2nd New Zealand Division that pure casualty figures and territorial gains do not capture. The New Zealanders were not a large army. They could never be. New Zealand had a population of under 2 million people when the war started. The 2nd New Zealand Division was essentially the entire offensive capacity the country could put into the field. Every man in that division was irreplaceable in a way that simply did not apply to larger nations. And yet those men threw themselves at the hardest defensive position in the Italian campaign, again and again, and kept going. Operation Diadem opened on the 11th of May 1944. This time the offensive was on a scale that the Gustav Line could not withstand. 13 Allied divisions attacked simultaneously along a front stretching many kilometers. The French Expeditionary Corps under General Juin found a route through the Orensai Mountains that the Germans had believed impassable. The Poles attacked Monte Cassino itself. The Americans pushed up the coast. And in the Cassino sector, the 2nd New Zealand Division and the rest of the 8th Army pushed through the shattered town and the valley beyond. By the 18th of May, the Polish flag was flying over the ruins of the monastery. The German 1st Parachute Division, which had held Monte Cassino through 4 major Allied offensives and 4 months of some of the heaviest fighting in the Italian campaign, was in retreat. The Gustav Line had broken. In the days that followed, as the German army fell back north, the diary entries took on a different tone. The earlier entries had been written in the heat of battle, in foxholes and tunnels and reinforced basements, by men who were fighting for their lives and trying to make sense of the enemy in front of them. The entries written after the fall of Cassino were more reflective, more considered, and several of them returned to the New Zealanders. One 1st Parachute Division officer who had survived all 4 Cassino battles wrote a lengthy reflection on the campaign in late May 1944. He described Monte Cassino as the hardest fighting he had experienced in 6 years of war, and he had fought in Poland, France, Crete, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. He wrote that many forces had attacked him at Cassino, and that all of them had shown courage at various times. But he singled out the New Zealanders for a specific quality that he struggled to find the right word for. He settled on the German word Beharrlichkeit, persistence, but not the frantic, costly persistence of an army being thrown into battle regardless of consequences. The calm, organized, patient persistence of men who had decided something needed to be done and were going to do it regardless of how long it took or how hard it was. He wrote that fighting men like that was a deeply uncomfortable experience, not because they were superhuman, but because they seemed to have decided, somewhere before the battle began, that they were not going to stop, and then they did not stop. The story of Monte Cassino is told in most history books as a story about strategic deadlock and eventual Allied triumph. It is told through the lens of generals and air power and logistics. The names that come up most often are the big ones: Freyberg, Alexander, Kesselring, Clark, the men who decided the shape of the battle from kilometers away. But in the tunnels and rubble and flooded craters of Cassino, the battle was decided by ordinary men doing extraordinary things in conditions that defied description. On one side, German paratroopers holding positions that should have been humanly impossible to hold. On the other side, New Zealanders attacking those positions day after day, in the dark and in the rain and under artillery fire, and through rubble so dense that sometimes the only way forward was to climb over the men in front of you who had fallen. The German officers who wrote those diary entries were not writing propaganda. They were not writing to impress anyone. They were writing for themselves or for their families, trying to process what they were experiencing. And what they kept coming back to, in different words and from different angles and from men who had never met each other and had no reason to agree, was the same thing. The New Zealanders did not stop. That quality is hard to manufacture. It is not something you can train into a man in a few weeks at a barracks. It comes from somewhere deeper. It comes from the culture a man grows up in and the values he carries into the field with him. It comes from the officers around him and the men beside him. And at Cassino, in the winter and spring of 1944, the 2nd New Zealand Division carried all of those things into one of the worst battles of the war and came out the other side. The German commanders who wrote about them did not know where that quality came from any more than the historians who came after them did. What they knew was what they saw. They saw men who kept coming, men who were quiet and focused and did not panic, men who were unhurried even when they were dying, men who reorganized on open ledges under machine gun fire and then kept climbing. And in the privacy of their diaries, surrounded by the wreckage of Monte Cassino, those German commanders wrote it down, not because they wanted to, but because they were honest enough and professional enough to record what they had actually seen, even when what they had seen was the enemy doing something they could not fully explain. New Zealand sent fewer soldiers to the Second World War than almost any other Allied nation that fought. But the men it sent, the farmers and tradesmen and teachers who crossed the world to fight in places they had never heard of, left a mark on the men who fought against them that lasted long after the guns stopped. At Monte Cassino, that mark was written down in ink, in diaries that sat in archives for decades before anyone thought to read them carefully. When you do read them, one thing is clear. The men on the other side of the wire knew exactly who they were dealing with. Even if nobody told them the name of the country those men came from, they would have remembered them. You do not forget men who keep coming. If this story made you think differently about what happened at Cassino, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories like this one, and most of them have never been told the way they deserve to be told.